My name is Rachel Donovan. I am 32 years old, and for the last 8 months, I've been trying to understand how my life fell apart in a single night. I am a surgeon. Not the kind you see on TV, dramatic and glamorous. The real kind 12-hour shifts, cold coffee, decisions made in seconds that determine whether someone's child goes home or doesn't. I built my career from nothing. My mother worked 2 jobs to put me through school. I knew what it meant to earn something. My husband, Daniel, was a high school history teacher. He drove a 7-year-old Honda. He packed his own lunch every morning and kept a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius on the nightstand. The first time I brought him to meet my mother-in-law, my husband's mother, Margaret, she looked at him the way people look at a wrong answer on a test, polite enough on the surface, completely dismissive underneath. Margaret Donovan was not a cruel woman in the way villains are cruel in movies. She was the other kind. The kind who smiled while she said things that left marks. She ran the Donovan family like a board meeting. Her late husband had built a small regional hospital network, and after he passed, she made sure everyone understood that she was still the one holding the keys. My husband was her only son, and in her mind, that made him hers in a way that a marriage certificate could never quite override. Daniel and I had been together for 4 years, married for 2. Our daughter, Nora, had just turned 3. She had Daniel's dark eyes and my stubborn streak, and she made both of us better people just by existing. We lived in our own home, 30 minutes from Margaret's house, but the distance never felt like enough. She called every other day. She had opinions about how we raised Nora, about how I worked too much, about how Daniel deserved someone who could be more present. She never said any of it directly to me. She said it to Daniel, quietly, consistently, the way water eventually shapes stone. I noticed it. Of course I noticed. But I loved my husband, and I trusted him, and I told myself that every family had its complications. I should have paid closer attention. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in March. I had just finished a 9-hour surgery. My feet ached. My neck was stiff. I drove home thinking about nothing except a hot shower and my daughter's face. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was off. Daniel always left it on when I worked late. Always. I told myself it was nothing. Inside, the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Nora's toys were picked up, the kind of clean that happens when someone is preparing to leave, not just tidying up. I walked into the bedroom. Daniel's side of the closet was open, half empty. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. On the kitchen counter, there was an envelope with my name on it. My handwriting recognition is good. I noticed details. The handwriting on that envelope was careful, deliberate, like someone who was trying very hard to keep their hand steady. Inside was a single page. Daniel had written that he was sorry, that he needed space, that he would be in touch about Nora, that he hoped I would understand someday. There was no explanation, no reason, no fight that had led to this. Just 8 sentences and a signature. I called him immediately. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I texted. Nothing came back. I called my sister. I called his closest friend. No one knew anything, or at least, that's what they said. By midnight, I was sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, still in my scrubs, trying to understand what had just happened to my life. The next morning, my mother-in-law arrived at my door before I had even made coffee. I remember thinking it was strange how fast she got there. I hadn't called her. I hadn't called anyone except my sister and Daniel's friend, and neither of them would have reached out to Margaret. But there she was, in a pressed blouse, holding a casserole dish, with the expression of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment. She sat at my kitchen table and told me that she was sorry. That she had no idea Daniel had been unhappy for so long. That men sometimes needed to find themselves. She said it the way someone reads from a script. The words were right, but the delivery was slightly off, just a beat too practiced. I asked her if she knew where he was. She said she didn't. Something small and cold moved through my chest, but I was too exhausted and too devastated to examine it closely. I thanked her for coming. I asked her to leave so I could call Nora's daycare and figure out the next 24 hours. She patted my hand and told me I was strong. The word felt like an accusation. I did not sign the separation papers. She had apparently already arranged for a family lawyer to draft a detail I only discovered a week later, when the papers arrived at my door through a courier. I did not ask for those papers. I did not agree to them. They simply appeared, as if my marriage was a business transaction that someone else had the authority to close. I put them in a drawer and did not open it again. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life, and I have stood at an operating table, watching someone's blood pressure drop and held my hand steady. I know hard. This was different. This was the kind of hard that follows you into sleep and waits for you when you wake up. I went to work because work was the only place where I knew exactly what was expected of me. I picked up Nora from daycare and read her stories and held it together until she was asleep. Then I sat in the quiet house and tried to understand what I had missed. Daniel had not given any signs. Or if he had, I hadn't seen them. He had been quieter the last few months, maybe. He had seemed distracted at dinner sometimes. But I had attributed it to end-of-semester pressure at the school. I hadn't asked the harder questions. That is the thing I return to most often, even now not what he did, but what I didn't ask. 8 months passed. I stopped expecting him to call. I stopped reaching out to mutual friends, who mostly gave me the same helpless shrug. I focused on Nora. I focused on my patients. I told myself that if Daniel had chosen to leave, then I had to find a way to live inside that truth. Then, on a Wednesday morning in November, I got a call from the administrative office of Lakeview Community Clinic, a small outpatient facility on the other side of the city, part of a network that my hospital had recently partnered with. They needed a supervising physician to come in for a quarterly review. My colleague had a conflict. I volunteered, mostly because sitting in my office had started to feel like a kind of slow suffocation. I drove across the city, checked in at the front desk, and was escorted by the clinic director to a back hallway to review patient flow documentation. On the way, we passed through the main waiting area. And that is where I saw him. Daniel was sitting at a small desk near the entrance, wearing a volunteer badge, helping an elderly man fill out intake paperwork. He had a beard now. His hair was longer. He looked thinner in the shoulders, like someone who hadn't been sleeping well. But it was him. I knew the way he held a pen. I knew the angle of his jaw. I knew the way he tilted his head slightly to the left when he was listening carefully. My body stopped moving before my brain caught up. The clinic director kept talking. I heard none of it. Daniel looked up, I don't know why, maybe the stillness caught his attention and our eyes met across the room. The color left his face. He stood up slowly, apologized to the man at the desk, and walked toward the hallway. His expression was not the expression of a man who had moved on. It was the expression of a man who had been found somewhere he had been hiding. I let the clinic director know I needed a moment. I followed Daniel into the hallway. We stood 3 feet apart and looked at each other. 8 months of silence between us, like a physical thing. I spoke first. I said his name. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he said, "You shouldn't be here." I told him I worked with the hospital that partnered with this clinic. That this was not something either of us planned. That I wanted an explanation, and I wanted it now. He looked down the hallway in both directions. Then he said, quietly, that this was not the right place. I told him there was no other place he was offering me. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I started to feel the anger underneath the shock, the months of silence, the note on the counter, the separation papers I never asked for, the countless times Nora had asked me where Daddy was and I had no answer to give her. Then he said, "My mother came to see me." I waited. 3 days before I left, he continued. His voice was flat, careful. "She came to the apartment while you were on a night shift. She sat at the kitchen table and she told me something. I didn't speak. She told me that you had applied for a position in Boston, a department chief role at a research hospital, a job you had never mentioned to me." He stared at him. "Danielle, she told me you had already accepted it." He looked up. "That you were planning to take Nora and relocate in 3 months. That you had decided not to tell me until the paperwork was signed. The hallway felt very still. She said, his voice dropped lower, that you had already spoken to a family attorney. That you were going to file, and that because I was just a teacher, the courts would give you primary custody and I would be a visitor in my daughter's life. I could not find words for a moment. I stood there, piecing together what I was hearing, and the shape of it was so calculated, so cold, that my mind kept sliding off the edges. None of that is true, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. He looked at me. I have never applied to anything in Boston, I said. I have never spoken to a family attorney about custody. I have never. Daniel, look at me. I have never planned to take Nora anywhere. He said nothing. She lied to you, I said. Your mother sat in our kitchen and told you a story that wasn't true, and you believed her, and you left. I watched his face move through something complicated and painful. He pressed his hand flat against the wall beside him like he needed something solid. She was so certain, he said, almost to himself. She had been working on this for a long time, I replied. My voice was quiet. She never thought I was right for you. She never stopped looking for a way to end this. He was silent for a long time. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleeplessness. I panicked, he said. I thought I was protecting Nora. I thought if I left first, I don't know what I thought. I didn't think. He shook his head slowly. I ran. I had a choice in that moment. I could feel it clearly, the same way I feel a decision point in surgery, the moment where you have two paths and the one you choose determines everything that follows. I told him about Nora. How she had stopped asking about him out loud, but had started carrying a photograph of the three of us in her coat pocket. How she checked the front door every evening when I came home, just for a second, the way children do when they're hoping someone else will be standing there too. How she had started calling her stuffed bear Daddy Bear and wouldn't go to sleep without it. Daniel put his face in his hands. We stood there in that clinic hallway for a long time. That evening, Margaret hosted her monthly dinner. It was a fixture in the Donovan family calendar, her late husband's siblings, their children, a few longtime family friends. Formal table. Good wine. Margaret at the head, presiding. I had been invited, as I always was, and had declined, as I usually did, citing a shift. This time, I called and said I would come. She sounded pleased. She always sounded pleased when she was winning. I arrived 20 minutes early. The table was set with the ivory china she reserved for occasions she considered significant. Her brother-in-law was already there. Her late husband's closest friend and his wife. Two cousins I had met at our wedding. All people who had watched this family for decades. All people who would remember what happened in that room. When everyone was seated and the first course had been served, Margaret lifted her glass and said how lovely it was to have the family together and how she hoped the coming months would bring everyone peace and new beginnings. She let her eyes rest on me briefly when she said it, with the particular warmth of someone who believes they have already won. I set down my fork. I said I wanted to share something, since we were all family, and since family deserved honesty. Margaret's expression shifted slightly. Not alarm. Not yet. More like the recalibration of someone who senses the wind changing direction. I told the table what she had told Daniel. I recounted it the same way he had recounted it to me, calmly, specifically, the false job offer, the invented attorney, the fabricated custody threat. I did not raise my voice. I did not use dramatic language. I simply described what she had done in front of the people who had known her longest. The table went quiet. Margaret said, carefully, that I was confused. That grief and stress could distort memory. That she had only ever wanted what was best for her son. I said that what was best for her son was to raise his daughter, sleep in his own home, and be married to a woman who loved him, and that she had taken 8 months of all 3 from him by telling him a lie. Her brother-in-law put down his wineglass. Her late husband's closest friend looked at the tablecloth. Margaret said, I only did what I thought. You thought he would be easier to control if I was gone, I said. It was the plainest version of the truth. I left no room in the sentence for another interpretation. The silence that followed was long and specific. The kind of silence that means something has shifted in a room and everyone present knows it. Her cousin, a woman in her 60s who had watched Margaret operate for 40 years, looked at her and said, quietly, "Margaret." Just her name. Nothing else. But in the way she said it, there was an entire verdict. Margaret did not have a response to that. I thanked the table for their time. I picked up my coat. At the door, I turned back once. Margaret was still sitting at the head of her table, glass in hand, surrounded by people who were no longer looking at her the same way. The empire was exactly the same. Every piece of ivory china was still in place. But the room had changed in the way rooms do when the truth enters them and doesn't leave. I drove to my sister's house, where Daniel had been staying for 3 days since the clinic, since the hallway conversation, since everything had finally cracked open into the light. Nora was already asleep in the guest room, a small shape under a quilt, the photograph still in her coat pocket on the chair beside the bed. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. He looked up when he heard me. I sat across from him. We didn't speak for a moment. Then he asked how it went. I told him the truth had a way of settling into a room and rearranging the furniture. He almost smiled at that. Almost. We talked for a long time that night. Not about Margaret. Not about the 8 months, or the note on the counter, or the separation papers that were still in a drawer at my house, unsigned. We talked about Nora. About the photograph in the coat pocket. About the stuffed bear with the name neither of us had chosen for it, but that Nora had assigned with complete certainty. We talked about what we wanted the next year to look like, and the year after that, and whether it was possible to rebuild something that had been broken by someone else's hands. I don't have a clean answer to that last question. I don't think anyone does. Healing is not a single decision. It is a long series of smaller ones, made every morning, sometimes every hour. What I know is that Daniel came home. What I know is that Nora heard the front door and came running down the hallway in her socks and crashed into him with her whole body, and he held her for so long that my sister had to leave the room. What I know is this. Margaret believed that the structure she built, the dinners, the family loyalty, the quiet, consistent pressure was stronger than what Daniel and I had built together. She believed that if she removed one support beam at exactly the right moment, the whole thing would come down. She was wrong. Not because love is invincible. It isn't. It is fragile and requires attention and can be damaged by neglect and deception in ways that don't always repair. She was wrong because she fundamentally misunderstood what she was dealing with. She saw a teacher in a 7-year-old Honda and decided she knew the full measure of the man. She saw a surgeon who worked long hours and decided she knew the full measure of the marriage. She did not. The man she called unsuitable spent 8 months volunteering at a free clinic because he didn't know what else to do with himself and he needed to feel like he was still useful to someone. That is the man she underestimated. That is the man who came home. If you are watching this and you recognize something in this story, the family member who never accepted your partner, the quiet campaign to dismantle what you built, I want you to hear this clearly. The people who try to end your love story are usually more afraid of your happiness than they are invested in your well-being. Hold on to what is real. Ask the hard questions before they go unanswered for 8 months. And if someone you trust hands you a version of events that would require you to leave without a conversation, please have the conversation first. Thank you for being here. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, please share it with them. I'll see you in the next one.